I haven't obviously read this yet, but I really enjoyed The Great Deluge, specifically because you gave up the two people who needed giving up in that, which was Governor Blanco and Mayor Reagan.
Well, thank you. Great Deluge was about Hurricane Katrina. I wrote. I was living in New Orleans and teaching at Tulane at the time, and did a lot of reporting work going around and finding out what happened, and including finding out that Mayor Reagan had hidden on the 27th floor of a Hyatt when he was supposed to be at the Emergency Operations Center. And it was actually somebody from Homeland Security that had to take over the duties. And the warning I learned from that is I had never realized before that in an emergency, whatever community you're in, that the mayor is supposed to head the emergency operation center, and Mayor Reagan in New Orleans was a zero, completely cracked. So I may not take mayors as lightly anymore. You know, you really want somebody who quirky's fun, but you want somebody who would be a good crisis manager when in a dangerous situation.
You know, there's a perception that President Reagan, his critics and critics of conservatives like to say that, well, Ronald Reagan never really went to church. And I wanted to ask you about his faith and the role that faith played in his presidency. You know, a lot of us have criticized President Obama. To this day, he has not selected a church to attend in Washington, D.C. And for a lot of us, that's important. I mean, I think a president's faith and his beliefs and his spirituality play a key role in his decision-making. Talk, if you will, about the President Reagan's faith and what role that played in his presidency.
It's an enormous part of the man. And actually, I have a firm belief that when he was shot and almost died, and we now know how close it was there in March of '81 when he was at the Hilton and then got thrown in the car, and of course got rushed to George Washington Hospital. There's a good new book out called Operation Rawhide.
Rawhide Down.
Rawhide Down,
yeah.
It is. I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right.
I just interviewed the author 2 weeks ago.
Yeah,
he was amazing.
It's a wonderful, interesting book. Highly recommend it. But what I picked up from that when going over the diaries was just how when he woke up and recognized he had life still, how he was going to dedicate his presidency to God, meaning he was not going to ever forget how fragile life is when he had that near-death experience. Even before that, his faith was an enormous part. And, you know, many presidents, I mean, we forget now, it gets controversial, but, you know, Franklin Roosevelt, if you read the D-Day prayer to the country, FDR would invoke God constantly during his presidency. And Reagan, when he was starting in broadcasting in Iowa, WOC, World of Chiropractor Radio in Davenport, and then went to Des Moines, you know, as a radio. You know, FDR was a big deal, and here was the President of the United States evoking God a lot in speeches. Why couldn't Ronald Reagan evoke God if he wanted to in the 1980s? But of course, that was post-60s. A more secular America, so it seemed kind of radical when President Reagan would be invoking God as much as he did. But during the World War II era, FDR was doing it all the time. So it's just how Reagan refused to give up what he thought was good about America, values of the 1930s and 1940s, even though he was president in the 1980s.
Well, and again, I heard this criticism that he never went to church, but the day he was shot on a Monday, I think, right? And he went to church the day before, because in this book, Rawhide Down, it talked about him going to church, and a pretty regular occurrence. So, you know, I think that history has kind of distorted or revised his faith and his spirituality and his beliefs.
Well, his mother was a extraordinarily devoted Christian, and his father was had a drinking problem, and he learned from his mother the power of the church and of faith and of God and of Christ in his growing up because of the strength of his mother. So it was a huge part of who he was. Yeah. And it's not a partisan thing. I mean, Jimmy Carter's obviously a man of great faith, and many presidents, most presidents are people of faith. I always say that all presidents like, whether it's President Obama or President George W. Bush, it's Lincoln, because no matter how bad they think they have it, Lincoln had it worse. I mean, he had half the country breaking off and had to deal with things. And so, you know, Lincoln was also a president of a great deal of prayer.
I get nervous when I hear things like, oh, most presidents are people of faith. I keep thinking about the New York Times interview where President Obama said that the Muslim call to prayer is the happiest, most pleasant sound he'd ever heard or something. I worry about what kind of faith. No, not to denigrate Muslims, but you wonder sometimes about the ideology and the faith and the Judeo-Christian center of President Obama. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Julie. It's an honor to be here today.
How are you?
I wanted to ask Douglas about what was the most interesting or fascinating aspect of Ronald Reagan's personality or character during his presidency, while you were doing your research. And also, I have another question about, do you think there might be a possibility of you doing some research in regard to President George W. Bush? Thank you.
Good questions. As for George W. Bush, he's in desperate need of a good biography, but his memoir did very well. And it's still a big book, one of the big books of the last year, and very well written. In fact, and I'm a connoisseur of presidential memoirs. This is one of the better ones that have been done, but he's there now at Southern Methodist University, opening up his presidential library soon. And it's going to have to open up the world of scholars to take different looks at him, and you will start getting a massive new literature coming out. There's the Bush family's been a little bit closed off. George Herbert Walker, 41, who lives in Houston, and I teach at Rice at Houston. In fact, I work with the Baker Institute some down there. He's been very quiet about his own legacy, George Herbert Walker Bush, because he had sons in politics. You know, Jeb may be a presidential nominee, if not this round. Look for him in 2016. Yeah, I mean, he may be entering and so they're always worried about stepping on their other brother, meaning not releasing too much stuff and all of that. As for with Reagan, getting to know, when you write biographies or study somebody, you get to know them so well, and the likability, the amiableness of Ronald Reagan astounds me always. I've come to the conclusion that the only people that he was really impressed by was Mother Teresa and the Pope. Meaning he had been a star out here in California for so long, and had known John Wayne and Bob Hope, and he knew he was autographing. He had fan clubs. Coming into Washington in '81 and having like the Washington Post style section didn't mean a lot to him. And he liked Tip O'Neill mainly because his sense of acting. Tip was such a character with his cigar and it's like a carnation coming out of his chest walking in, that Reagan, the actor, saw boy, wouldn't it be fun to cast him as the Boston Paul in a movie almost. And generally this sense of a non-elitism, a no feeling of specialness or privilege, and a true believing that being a middle-class American was the highest of all callings. His sense of patriotism was not ginned up for campaign trails. It was part of his DNA.
They said one of the notable things, and I just finished that book too, Rawhide Down, about his near assassination, and the president continually said to the nurses and the doctors who were treating him, "I'm sorry for inconveniencing you," or "I appreciate your effort." And they were all struck by how he went out of his way to thank all of his caregivers at that hospital. I'm also struck, and if you'll talk to the great love story that was Ronald and Nancy Reagan, and that was truly. There's been a lot of criticism about the family structure, and I guess there have been some rifts between Michael and Nancy and all that, but no one could doubt the sincere, deep bond that Ronald and Nancy Reagan had.
I've had a little bit of a grudge against Ronald Reagan because he makes the rest of us husbands look bad.
Yeah.
I keep reading about all these love notes he leaves around, and his wife leaves the house for an hour, and he's staring out the window for her return, and he was madly in love with Nancy Reagan, and he found the right mate for himself because they created a great working relationship. At its political core, Mrs. Reagan was tough in the sense of she had a very great instinct for who was not working in her husband's favor. I'll call it protectorate role if you'd like. There are other ways you could describe it, but she could smell a bad operator from a mile away. and knew who was going to try to do damage or claim credit or hurt her beloved Ronnie. Ronald Reagan liked people so much that he tended to want to think that people had a good side to them, that there was an essence of them that was, and he wanted to find that good part that you do, and so they worked very well together. He needed to have somebody that had backed his action and watched his back, and Nancy Reagan provided that.
Have you had any contact with Mrs. Reagan over the book at all?
Well, when I started doing the diaries, it stuck with me. And in fact, if you didn't, but if you asked me, it's my one law that she had said when I had the honor of getting to edit the diaries and work on these projects is don't go on TV shows, radio shows, and tell people what my husband would have done. Meaning, because you don't know. Right. So I have religiously heard that. So if I'm asked, what do you think Ronald Reagan would think of this current crop of Republican candidates? I don't know. Right. And as long as I followed that one thing, they've just the amount of support Mrs. Reagan gives these projects, the library. I mean, it's you probably heard already, but it's the most visited presidential library in the United States. It's got probably the best public outreach program of any. There are other ones that are good. Many of them are good, but this seems to be special here. And Mrs. Reagan's been a big part of that, making this special. When you're up here on the hilltop, there's a kind of genius of putting this up here. Because I've been doing research at the Johnson Library in Austin. It's like an asphalt parking lot turned inwards on itself. It's a very unpleasant experience going to that library. And then you come here and like, I don't want to leave, and I would fake how hard my research efforts are, honey, I'm here in Simi Valley, my feet are out there on a table
playing golf,
the valley.
Playing 9 holes. Yeah. Well, and of course, then there's the ever beautiful Clinton Library, which somebody once described as an upside-down refrigerator. Like, can you describe the Clinton Library?
Well, I'm not very keen on the architectural design of the Clinton Library. It's
upside-down refrigerator.
Upside-down refrigerator. If you haven't seen it, just pull it up online. But the worst part of that, that's up. People have different taste, but the archival,
good and bad.
Yeah, the inability to get archival material released from the Clinton Library is unbelievable. That's in a constant, and you can tell a lot about different presidents. The Reagan Library, the Eisenhower Library, Carter Library. All want things released because they're not really hiding any big things. And you deal with the Clinton Library, it's like everything is so paranoid about what's going to be found.
Go figure.
Yeah, okay.
Amazing. We have about 4 or 5 more minutes before we have to go. If you come over to the microphone, if you have a question for Douglas Brinkley, and then we've got, like I said, about 5 minutes. And I think, have you signed the books yet, or you haven't signed them?
I've signed some of the books.
So if you haven't had your book signed,
going out. If we're doing a book signing out of here, I'd love to see y'all.
Great. Go ahead, sir. Hi.
Yes, Doug, Patrick Gormley, I have a question regarding the thought process and the intellect of Ronald Reagan, the insights that you gained with looking over his notes as well as the other material. And during his administration, I recall that the press would always say that it was really the people around him that were the intelligence people, and that he was a little less gifted. And now in this current environment we're in, it seems to be the opposite. The intellect or the intelligence is always getting played in the press and the news media. However, the performance or the actual things that are coming out seem, like Mike has said so often today during the program, seem a little less so.
Well, let me answer it this way. It's a very good question, but for time, I just want to make one historical point. People too often forget how much Dwight Eisenhower influenced Ronald Reagan. Now, Reagan was here in California, and Nixon was the big deal. But he had a good relationship with Nixon Reagan, but he never wanted to be Dick Nixon. Eisenhower was a hero to Ronald Reagan from World War II, the Allied troops, two-term Republican. It's what brought Reagan in many ways away from Truman, being a Truman Democrat, to the Republican Party. And like Ike, many people thought Ike was out, golfing all the time, wasn't that smart, reading Louis L'Amour novels, that he had a brain trust around him. And now we know that Ike was hands-on with everything. It's called a hidden-handed presidency, but Eisenhower was fully engaged. The record proves it. That's what's happening with Ronald Reagan. It's sort of the Ike syndrome. Now, why, you say, would Reagan play it that way? Well, you deflect a lot of criticism, right? You're not trying to be the intellectual. You just stay above the fray, and you go like Ike did. Ike wasn't just a two-term president. He could have won a third term. You talk about Nixon and Kennedy in '60. Eisenhower could have easily won a third term. Now, he had heart problems. He was getting up in age, et cetera. But so Reagan saw, look, that's not bad. Two-term Ike, and it could have been a three-term Ike. I could play it that way, too. I don't have to be arguing. And he used the diaries, like if he was angry at Gloria Steinem or Jesse Jackson, which he was. He didn't go to the microphone as president and say, well, Jackson says in, and have that media moment, the square off. He would vent in his diary one night, got it out for the historical record in a Best Now, a book that's almost mandatory reading, and got his say. And he had that kind of great inner control on things. And the book I'd like to write about Reagan, and coming back out here, though, is in looking at the Reagan's crisis of 1983 in the fall, when we had the Lebanon and Grenada back to back, and what was going on when those two foreign policy crises, because Reagan came out of Grenada with like an 80% approval rate. I mean, he went skyrocketed up, and it was a very, very interesting moment with our Navy SEALs and an intervention there at the same time grappling with our Lebanon policy.
I was also struck, and I know I talk probably too much, but it changed me and impacted me to meet President Bush for a couple of hours like that. The image of President Bush, not unlike that of Ronald Reagan, was that he was kind of disengaged, wasn't really connected on a lot of levels. I was so blown away by how engaged President Bush was in his presidency and all the minutia that he knew about, and he was so connected. He even said nuclear the right way when we were visiting with him in person. But I think that image that that caricature almost of Ronald Reagan is sort of disengaged and aloof and just 9 to 5, not true at all.
Clark Clifford, the great Democratic, he was the Carville of his day, if you'd like, but he lampooned Reagan as being an amiable dunce. And that really circulated in liberal crowds a lot until it became almost believed. But what's happened is with the publication of the speeches, if you read Ronald Reagan's speeches of the 60s on what's going to happen to the Soviet Union and the decline of communism, he nailed it.
Spot on.
So who's the intellectual of the 60s?
The
guy who called it all right, or the people who didn't now? And so with the way when the Cold War ended and the wall came down, and then this flow of Reagan's leavings, his writings, more memos coming out and things, we're starting to get him in perspective, and he's a much more hands-on president than the image. That does not mean he did overtaxed himself. He believed also in social time, going to bed at a certain time, not letting problems worry him. He was not like Carter, who, micromanaging things and not sleeping through crisis and stuff. So I don't want to overstate this, but it's a much more of a work beast president in Ronald Reagan than the public understands even now.
Time for about one or two more questions. Dink, go ahead.
I can talk loud.
Sure.
I'm curious. Obviously you had to edit and figure out which ones you were going to include and which ones you weren't. But what were your restrictions as far as how you actually physically handled the cards? Did you have to wear gloves? Did you have to wear a mask? Did you have to work in a hermetically sealed room? What were the restrictions on these things?
Well, because I was able to carefully, I didn't have to wear gloves, and I wasn't hermetically sealed, although I was in a quarters here where it was properly maintained, having to just look at them and flip them because they're written on both sides and decide what would go into the book. These are going to be used, I mentioned in my introduction to the book, I think scholars can come back and use these in so many different ways. I didn't have the time or the resources to find the lines and then match them to the speech you could do a whole paradigm with these cards. But what we wanted to do was get these open in the centennial year, get this book out so people can start seeing. And when you go see them here, you'll see they're incredible black books, and he would file them away. And then it's just really an extraordinary document. So it's just been thrilling to get to hold them, touch them. We're doing this evening, Brian Williams had come out some weeks ago and filmed me doing research on them. I think he's going to air that tonight on the launch of the books on NBC Nightly News, because they were so the physical document. That's why people need to come and look at them. And some memos in history aren't that interesting to look at. These cards are eminently fascinating and are only going to grow in stature because he's the great communicator, right? I mean, that's a nickname he has in history. Well, this is the tools of the great communicator. So it's a nice link up in history. And John F. Kennedy was a master at the press conference, and how he did press conferences are of interest to press. But Reagan's known for these types of speeches. He could do a better rubber chicken dinner speech than anybody, and a lot of it is humor, hard wisdom, earned from classic thinking. So really don't pepper your political speech with grounded in some of the classics, and then some humor mixed in, and then deal with the more contemporary issue and give people a nice, and he never over put people down. His jokes were more ribbing than cynical. There was a hallmark side to him. He liked cheeriness quite a bit, even in his put down humor, and some of those kind of jokes can be more devastating than ones that try to go for the jugular.
And this was a great opportunity for you, those of you who came here today, ladies and gentlemen, because from here, as Douglas mentioned, he's going to be featured tonight on the NBC Nightly News, and he's flying to New York. He's going to be on Fox and Friends, and I can't believe you're going to go on MSNBC tomorrow morning with Morning Joe. Oh, please. Yeah, well, bring your body armor with you when you go into that place. If I walked into that studio, I think my hair would catch on fire. But a nice opportunity for you to get a sneak peek of this great book, The Notes. It was so nice of you all to come out this morning and watch the radio show, and we appreciate you being here. God bless you, and God bless Ronald Reagan. Thanks, everybody.